Hey all, before this video starts, I wanted to let you know that a couple channels have done collaborations with me on their channels. They are Grimtail Brothers and The Sinful Savant. There will be cards on this video, with links, so please check their channels out and subscribe. Now, enjoy the fear. My cat. I love cats. I've always loved cats. Well, to be fair, I love all animals, but especially cats. Some people don't understand this. They tell me that cats don't really love you and that they're not loyal. They just tolerate you for the food. I have to disagree. Even when their bellies are full and their litter boxes clean, my cats have always been very loving and affectionate. I've even had one cat that was very protective of me. Her name was Nyx, and she was a mouthy little black cat. For as tiny as she was, she had an enormous personality. She was also fairly independent, and very much a typical aloof cat. She liked to cuddle, but only on her terms. Most nights, she slept on the cat tree in my bedroom, though the pillow next to me on the bed was always left open for her, in case she decided to use it, which she occasionally did. Because she was such an independent cat, I thought it was a little strange when I woke up 3 nights in a row to her sleeping next to me on a pillow. During the same time, she began hanging around me all the time during the day, and where she was normally talkative, she'd become quiet and almost solemn. I began to worry that she was sick, so I made an appointment to take her to the vet. Of course, the vet gave her a clean bill of health. She asked if I'd made any changes around the house that night that might have upset her. Cats are creatures of habit, and they don't tend to like change. I worked from home, and usually kept the same schedule, so I really couldn't think of anything. And then I remembered that I recently rearranged my bedroom. I previously had her cat tree by the window, and my bed on the opposite wall. However, it was summer, and I was trying to save money on air conditioning, so I swapped them so I could sleep next to the open window. The vet suggested that I swap them back if possible and see if her behavior changed. So that day, I switched the cat tree to the window and the bed to the opposite wall. Nyx immediately began sleeping on her cat tree again for the next few nights. I left the window open and the air conditioning off, even with the change, because even though it was a bit warmer away from the window, I was determined to save some cash. Everything seemed to be back to normal for the next week. Then one night, I woke to Nyx on the pillow, next to me, meowing. I rolled over and told her to go back to sleep, but she kept touching the back of my head with her paw and meowed forlornly at me. This was something she sometimes did first thing in the morning when she wanted fed. But it was still dark out, so I pulled the sheet over my head and fell back to sleep. I don't know how long I was sleeping, but I awoke again to Nyx sitting on top of me. She growled low in her throat, and I was about to admonish her sleepily when I heard a hushed man's voice curse in the darkness. I sat up, sending Nyx flying. I saw him sitting half in and half out of my window, apparently having removed the screen. He had undone his pants and was masturbating, though now he was frozen mid-stroke, with eyes wide at having been caught. I screamed, and Nyx landed on his lap and attacked his dick like a cheetah on a gazelle. The man fell out of the window, Nyx still attached and squalling like an alley cat. I grabbed my cell phone and jumped off the bed, running to the bedroom door, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I was afraid he would hurt Nyx. I called 911, and while I told them what was happening, Nyx jumped back on the windowsill and over to her cat tree, where she sat cleaning herself. I heard sobbing outside my window. For half a second I was split between running out of the room and running over to close the window. I decided he was probably too injured to reach in the window and hurt me, and ran over, slamming the window and locking it. They took the man away in an ambulance, and not long after, the police told me that he'd spilled his entire story. He had been peeping in my window while I slept for a few weeks, ever since Nyx had started acting up. Apparently, he got off on watching unsuspecting women sleep. And my moving the bed close to the open window was extra tempting, and when I moved it back, he decided to remove the screen and come in to feel the same closeness he'd gotten used to. Even mentioning that just makes my stomach queasy. What kind of weirdo not only peeps on unsuspecting people, but prefers them to be asleep and helpless? I don't know what would have happened if Nix hadn't been there, or if she'd run away rather than attacking the man I obviously saw as a threat. But that isn't what happened. What happened was that my cat saved me, and every night for the rest of the time we lived there, she stayed on the cat tree by the window, guarding me while I slept. No one will ever be able to tell me cats don't care about their people. The factory. My hometown is all banks and restaurants now. Once upon a time, it was a bustling factory town, with several major manufacturing companies running multiple plants and employing much of the surrounding towns. By the time I was a teenager, the major manufacturers had pulled out, and the factories had closed up, leaving their abandoned husks never far from view. As teenagers in a small city, me and my friends were alley rats. Kids with money were the ones that hung out at the new mall just outside the small city. We hung out around the public park, in the alleys behind the nearly deserted main street, and in the abandoned factories around town. Those were the best spots. It was like our new land, just waiting to be explored. And that's what we did. We laid claim to underground tunnels, empty halls, strange-shaped rooms that were stripped of everything valuable. It was all ours, and we practically lived there after school. It was on a normal Tuesday in our senior year that we had an experience that we will never forget. Me and Robert, we called him Huckleberry Rob, were huddled by our lockers as the last bell rung the end of the school day. He showed me the stash of spray paint cans he had in his oversized book bag. I found them in a dumpster behind the Walmart. I was amazed at all the different colors he had managed to swipe. He and I considered ourselves artists and rappers, and actually, we weren't too bad. Today was going to be a good day. Danny and Fry were going to meet us at our favorite spot in an abandoned factory, all the way out on the edge of town. It would take us a while to get there on our bikes. It was worth it though. This particular factory had an odd underground room we like to call the egg room. They were bringing the beer and weed. In the egg room, we never had to worry about anyone bothering us, and that's the way we liked it. Rob and I were the first to get there. We always got there first. The other guys were probably high already, but Rob and I didn't really care about that. The only thing I was really waiting for was Danny's portable CD player that used batteries. The hissing sound of the spray cans and the echo of our shuffling feet were the only sounds in the large oval room. I was focused on the piece I was making. I was going for a sort of evil chickadee and an egg, egg theme for the egg room, right? It wasn't turning out the way I had hoped, and I headed over to the entrance to the room where we kept buckets of black and white paint and rollers to cover things up. I was just popping the lid off the bucket of black paint when I heard it. I froze for a moment, the way you do when you think you hear something strange. I listened for a moment. There was only Rob's spray can hissing quietly as he worked on his own piece. Just as I went to go on with what I was doing, I heard it again. This time I was sure. I wasn't sure what it was, but it was something, and it seemed to be coming from deeper underground, past the egg room. Then suddenly, the entire room was filled with an overwhelming, echoing, terrifying screaming. Rob and I took one look at each other and ran for the exit. We didn't bother to grab our flashlights or book bags. We ran as fast as we could, and the screaming chased us all the way to the surface. We almost ran Danny and the other guy over as we shot out of the tunnel that led back to the screaming underground. The sound was pouring out of the tunnel and no words were exchanged as we all four took off on our bikes as fast as we were able. That week, we talked about nothing else and planned a return trip to find out what was haunting those tunnels. We were certain we were going to find real ghosts. On the next Wednesday, I was at home washing the dishes. I heard a knock at the door. My mother answered the door and was surprised that it was a police officer that wanted to speak to me. When I came to the door, I saw that the officer was holding the bag that I had left in the egg room. Apparently, I left some school papers in the bag. It was explained to me that the police had found the body of a missing man in the factory a ways further in than we had been. He had fatally wounded himself on a sharp piece of metal while trying to steal it for scrap. He had crawled to an intercom system that had still been connected and was calling for help. I wasn't charged with anything and was warned to stay out of the abandoned factories. But I'll never forget, and I'll always feel slightly responsible for that man's life. The Undesired Experience. 33 Colross Road. A house which I will never forget. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, with a ranch-like design which consisted of a large cloakroom, living room, dining room, bar, study, kitchen with a scullery, storeroom, courtyard, double electric garage, 3 cottages in the back, pool, sauna behind my parents' shower, and a 3-acre garden. It was the year 1999 when we moved in. We all had a blast moving into that joint, but there was something which awaited us, and it was going to change our perception of this gem forever. In the wee hours of one morning, my mother woke up and couldn't understand what woke her. She went downstairs for some tea and a smoke, and suddenly the lights went out. She also heard the taps in the kitchen and bathrooms were making a bizarre dredging noise, and the dogs were going ballistic. Now here's where things became absolutely terrifying. She heard someone trying to break down the gate of the house, which secured us from the public road. My mother ran around the house screaming about someone trying to break in. Her screaming woke up my sister and my father, but not me. I slept through the commotion. The police were then called, but the suspect got away. When they arrived, nothing could be done except for us to lock ourselves away in the house for the night and address the problem in the morning. When morning came, I heard about the incident. I couldn't believe I slept through the whole thing. When I went to investigate, I had the biggest shock of my life. The gate was practically lying flat in the driveway. Any old body could have come through. Thank goodness no one did, and we got the gate fixed. According to my mother, she assumed the suspect who broke down the gate knew our landlady and decided to pay her an unpleasant visit by breaking down her gate to try and intimidate her. I presume the suspect made a dash for it once they heard a cacophony of screams, shouts, and yells from a family, not the landlady. After the incident, my mother was suspicious of the house and ended up in terrible habits such as staying awake all night, not taking my sister and I to school, not allowing our domestic nor our gardener to do their jobs, wouldn't allow me to play in the backyard, wouldn't let me spend time in my little hideout, and not allow my sister to go out because she was worried something might happen to her. There were a few more eerie experiences which took place in that house, and my mother's paranoia only grew worse until we moved out 6 months later. I have to say, although you all are going to think I'm crazy, I miss that house. I miss its Spanish-style paved walls and Cape Dutch exterior, the smell of the flowers from the syringa trees, the veld in the backyard, picking prunus fruits and peaches off the trees, the brick Wendy house, aka my little hideout, where I used to spend time with friends and have me time, that fascinating fish water feature used to fill up the pool, and having a good sweating session in the sauna. 33 Colross had such great potential to become our official dream home, and all it took was for one undesired experience, which led to a few more, to destroy such a gem. I lived out in Gresham, Oregon for a couple years. It is a rain-drenched, lush area of the state, located in close proximity to Portland. I was fresh out of high school, and eager to seek out new adventures. My friends and I are what you might call rednecks. Mind you, not the type that enjoy watching NASCAR on the lawn sofa, but more the type that love the outdoors. Whether it be fishing, hunting, camping, trail riding, shooting, blowing stuff up, off-roading, or just having a bonfire, we loved it all, and spent the majority of our time doing it. We frequented many beautiful locations around that area, including Mount Hood, Mount Bachelor, Goat Mountain, Larch Mountain, Lolo Pass, 1,000 Acres, among countless others. But undoubtedly my favorite place was Wildcat Mountain. Back then, Wildcat was the best. It is an old, rather secluded logging mountain, located just outside of Sandy, Oregon. Anyone who is familiar with the area will likely have heard of it. There are a few scattered residents there, but they are few and far between. The mountain itself was pretty rough, with mostly old dirt roads and crumbling stretches of broken pavement. A lifted 4x4 truck or Jeep is definitely recommended for those attempting to traverse it. The mountain once played host to countless parties and massive bonfires with hundreds of people in attendance. I can't even count the amount of drunken fiascos I've been a part of up there. The remote location of the mountain allowed for loud gatherings to occur while being mostly unheard by locals. Cops also seldom patrol this area simply because it is so large and difficult to traverse. This, of course, made it the perfect party spot. Unfortunately, the mountain was recently closed off some time back. A massive old tree was fallen directly on the road that leads to the main trails. The damn thing has got to be at least 15 feet around and weigh a couple tons. Most people said that this was in response to a 20-year-old girl getting alcohol poisoning up there and not being able to reach the hospital in time. It's tragic, really, but I never did find a conclusive answer. Whatever the reason, the mountain now remains mostly inaccessible to the public, unless you've got a vehicle that is capable of climbing over that monstrous tree. Recently, I was reminiscing all about the good times I've had there over the years, all of the forgotten memories with good friends. However, one night in particular stood out to me. It was towards the end of the Wildcat Mountain days, and it still unnerves me to this day. The day started out much like any other. It was a Friday, and I was looking forward to getting off work and enjoying the weekend. It was early springtime, and unseasonably warm for that time of year. After texting some of my friends, we decided to head off to Wildcat and have a bonfire after we were off work. I finished out the remainder of my day and texted my friends Eric and Chris. We decided to meet up and gather supplies for the night. Chris worked for a shipping company who always kept a large supply of pallets on hand. Eric and I met him at his work and loaded up several broken pallets into Eric's truck until it was full to capacity. We then headed out to collect our guns and some ammo before departing. I texted Andrea, another friend of mine, and asked her if she wanted to go. She agreed and told me she was going to bring Brittany and Megan along too. We met up with the girls an hour or so later and proceeded to head out. Eric drove his Chevy Silverado, and Chris and Megan went with him. Andrea and Brittany rode with me in my Jeep Wrangler. We arrived in Sandy a little after 6 that night. We stopped by the gas station and liquor store to purchase our essentials for the night, and after refueling, we were back on the road. By the time we had arrived on the foot roads of Wildcat Mountain, the sun was beginning to set. Andrea and Brittany had already begun drinking their fruit-flavored vodka, and I could tell they were already getting a little tipsy. I rolled down the window to feel the cooling mountain breeze as we rode deeper into the mountain. Partway up, Brittany began begging me to stop the car so she could pee. I gave her a hard time about not going when we were at the gas station, but eventually I agreed to stop, after she threatened to let loose on my back seat. I pulled the Jeep over, and Brittany and Andrea hopped out and headed into the woods to the right. Eric pulled his truck up behind me as Megan also hopped out to join the other two girls. I pulled the handbrake before stepping out into the brisk evening. I decided I might as well go too, as we still had a little farther to go before we reached our destination. I began to relieve myself in the front of my Jeep while looking around at the forest around me. Luckily for us, most of the snow had melted already, but trace amounts could be seen in the ditches along either side of the road. I took a deep breath of the chilling, damp mountain air and felt my soul revitalize. The air of nature has always just seemed so calming to me, and it is a most welcome departure from the polluted, stale air of the city. Below us, the pavement lay cracking and obviously quite neglected, even more so than the last time we had been there, or so it would seem. The forest stood silent, with only the occasional sounds of bird calls breaching the rumbling sound of my engine. I scanned the mesmerizing scene until something on the edge of the road caught my eye. In a tree, about 30 yards in front of me, on the left side of the road, there was something dangling from a tree, about 20 feet up. It looked like a rucksack or something. Hunters and campers often string their food up from trees to try and prevent attracting bears. But this one was right at the edge of the road. It would have been a terrible place to camp, let alone to hunt. My headlights just barely illuminated the bottom of it, but it was too difficult to make out what the object actually was. Luckily for me, I kept a large spotlight with me that I could plug into my outlet in the Jeep. Thing comes in handy if you ever drop your phone out there and have no battery. I plugged it in and shined the beam upwards towards the object. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing, but soon was stunned to discover that it wasn't a sack up there, but an entire deer hanging about 25 feet above the ground. Its head hung lifeless, and a massive hole was ripped in its stomach, from which entrails, guts, and organs dangled out of. Blood and various fluids had soaked the dirt and snow below the tree. The antlers, which I had first thought to be tree branches, were broken and gnarled, an obvious sign of struggle. I looked around for an anchor line, but there were no visible ropes or ties securing it from anywhere, at least that I could tell. It was just haphazardly sprawled out on a massive tree branch, like someone had launched it out of a catapult and lodged it in the tree. My immediate thought suspected that this was the handiwork of a cougar, but the size of the deer made that unlikely. It was a buck, and I'm no expert in deer or adolescent rates, but I'd say it was pretty close to being full grown. I know that leopards and other big cats will sometimes drag their prey into trees, but could a mountain lion really do that to a fully grown deer? They don't get nearly as big as leopards, and the leopard's prey of choice, the gazelle, is much smaller than a deer. I called out to the other members of our group to come take a look. We all stood around and gawked at the scene for a few minutes. None of us had ever seen anything quite like it, and the grisly sight made me feel an uneasy sense of dread. I voiced my theory of the mountain lion to the others. However, Chris quickly shot it down with the same argument I had used previously. We thought perhaps it was a cruel joke or prank of some sort, albeit a messed up one at that. Serious banter was quickly replaced by jokes about serial killers, and my momentary dread began to subside. For a moment, a strange, fleeting thought of retreat crossed my mind, but I wasn't about to let something as meager as a mutilated deer carcass stop me from enjoying my Friday night. We all piled back into the rigs and proceeded further up the mountain, continuing onward as the concrete road gave way to that of a crude gravel one. Several minutes later, we arrived at the infamous fork in the road. The road straight ahead led to miles upon miles of more trails. The path to the right was the way we normally proceeded, but there was quite a substantial amount of snow on that path. After discussing our options for a few minutes, we decided to proceed to the right and attempt the snow to reach our normal spot. Eric pulled his truck around me and rumbled on to the right and into the snowy path despite our initial hesitance. He hadn't got more than 100 yards in when he began to run into trouble. His truck was suddenly stopped by the large snowdrifts on the road. He went in reverse and crept backwards a few feet. He put it in drive and attempted to roll forward, but with little success. He repeated the pattern several times before his back end began to sink downwards. With one last effort, he gunned it forward. Snow and slush flung out sporadically as his truck roared in an attempt to free itself. His truck shook back and forth, but soon the tires spun freely in the deep snow. He was stuck. Brittany, Andrea, and I found this all rather amusing as we looked on to Eric struggling to free himself. Eventually, he stopped moving altogether and waved his hand out the window, signaling his distress. I flipped my Jeep around and began to back up towards him. The idea was to use my twin pairs of chains to link our rigs, rear bumper to rear bumper, on the hooks, while I pulled straight out, dragging him backwards down the trail. We've performed similar maneuvers at least a dozen times before, sometimes with 4 or 5 rigs hooked up all at once. Unfortunately, upon inspection of the chains, I quickly realized that they were too short to stretch from the dry gravel to the spot in which Eric was stranded. And because of this, I would have to reverse up the trail onto the snow patch in order to get close enough to him. Chris hopped out to guide me backwards, and cautiously I backed the Jeep up into the snow. We linked up, and I began to slowly pull away. The chain pulled taut, and Eric's truck began to shimmy slightly. I only managed to pull him a few feet before I too lost traction. I put my Jeep in reverse and again backed up towards him, this time with the intent of getting a running start for more momentum. By the way, don't ever try this with chains. If either of those chains would have snapped, they could have easily cleaved one of our heads straight off our body. Regardless, I gunned it, and it jerked Eric's truck a bit, but still was not enough to free it completely. The chain was pulled tight, and I began to spin my wheels. Back into reverse I went, and then forward again. My engine screamed and my RPMs jumped to dangerous levels, but all I succeeded in doing was spinning the tires and sinking deeper. His truck was just too heavy, and I didn't have enough room for momentum anymore. We both exited our vehicles to once again inspect the situation. My Jeep was now dug deep into the snow, to the point where the fenders were hovering only an inch or two above the top layer. Eric's truck had been moved maybe 5 feet, but that wasn't even the worst of it. The chain was pulled tight, so tight that we were unable to disconnect it. We were both stuck, now without the ability to leave. Not the first time that had happened to us, however. So we decided to just chill for a bit and try and think of a different plan. We broke out the pallets and lighter fluid and sparked up a fire in a dry patch on the side of the road. The drinks came out, and all the troubles of life began to slowly slip away, including the current predicament we found ourselves in. We all laughed and reminisced for a while about all the good times we've had together. Eventually, after we were all several beers deep, we decided we possessed the cognitive and physical capabilities required to free our trucks. Everyone else was quite drunk by that point except for Eric, who seldom if ever actually drank. Eric, Chris, and I returned to the trucks, and once again I tried pulling him out. Again, we had little luck moving anywhere, so we busted out the shovels and began digging away at the snow and ice. An hour or so of struggling, digging and drinking passed, and little progress had been made. The chain was still pulled too tight to disconnect, and we were running out of options. We began to realize that we may not be going anywhere for a long while. It's not as though this idea frightened us, at least initially. As I said, we had been stranded before, but it was a bit of an inconvenience. When given the choice of sleeping in my own bed or in the driver's seat of my Jeep in the middle of the freezing woods, well, that's not a very hard decision to make. We decided our best course of action would be to call our friend Alex and ask for help. By this time, it was around midnight, and we knew Alex would likely be sleeping, and definitely less than thrilled to hear from us so late. Unfortunately, we didn't have much of a choice unless we wanted to spend the night out there. Eric strolled around our makeshift camp, attempting to get a signal for his phone. Eventually, he was successful and managed to get a hold of Alex. Alex was not exactly excited about driving all the way up there to help, but he agreed nonetheless. He had a hand winch, which we could use to hopefully pry ourselves free of our little situation. The downside was that Alex drove a BMW 323i, and there was simply no way he would make it up to where our trucks were located. That meant that we would have to make the journey back down the mountain on foot to the point where Alex could meet us. A good 3 or 4 mile trek at least. Before we had a chance to thoroughly discuss the plan, Chris rose up in a drunken stupor and began stumbling back down the road towards the bottom. I guess he felt inspired at the time because next thing we knew, he had disappeared into the darkness. I decided I had to follow, so I prepared myself to give chase to Chris. I grabbed my Taurus 44 Magnum from my Jeep and gave chase several minutes later. Better to be safe than sorry after all. Eric and the girls elected to stay behind and watch the camp, and so I headed out into the darkness alone. I began walking down the mountain in my slightly inebriated state. The environment away from the fire had gotten very cold, but luckily the alcohol dulled my senses to some capacity. I called out to Chris several times on my way, but he didn't answer back. It surprised me how quickly he had gotten out of earshot from me. But in hindsight, I hadn't left until several minutes after him. That or he was just too drunk to call back. Chris is a guy with an iron will, and once he sets his mind to something, you'd be hard-pressed to stop him. And when he's drunk, that will increase at least tenfold. I walked down the mountain in complete silence for quite some time. By that point, it was probably at least 1 or 2 a.m., and the forest around me had fallen uncomfortably silent. It's strange. I was so used to this place being so loud and full of people and noises. But tonight, I was completely alone in the dark. The normal environmental sounds were non-existent, and the only sound I heard was that of my footsteps meeting the torn-up pavement and snow. Not even a single gust of wind managed to penetrate the dense canopy of the woods. It was so quiet, I could almost hear the sounds of my own heartbeat. Being alone in a dark forest at night is not a fun sensation. Obviously, there are no lampposts or artificial lights up there, but luckily for me, it was a full moon that night, which illuminated the immediate vicinity enough to travel without need of a flashlight. I could only see as far as the tree line, however, and on either side of the road stood an enclave of monolithic trees in high attention, like soldiers given a command. Seeing past them from the road was near impossible. I called out to Chris several more times on regular intervals, but he never did answer me back. So I soon gave up trying altogether. I'll be honest, it did make me quite anxious to not get a response. I continued walking down the mountain for quite a while, past the small dirt pit, and down towards the fork in the road. Still, there was not a single sound to be heard from any direction. No chirping of crickets, or calls of owls, nor a distant howl of a coyote. Just silence. It's strange what happens when the human mind goes through extended bouts of silence. You never realize just how much you rely on sound for comfort. Only in complete silence do you realize how much you miss the white noise ambiance. Suddenly, a disruption shot out through the dark woods. The sound of a nearby snapping twig halted me in my tracks. I froze and glanced in the direction in which I thought the sound had originated. Hand ready to draw my .44 from its holster, my heart began to pound in my chest as I stared into the darkness of the forest. In that moment, my senses seemed to heighten. I felt every chilling breeze and heard the drip-drop of water from the leaves. I saw nothing, despite my heightened awareness. I questioned myself on whether I had heard the noise at all. I know that the mind can play tricks when in an uncomfortable situation, and I wondered if I had simply fallen for it. Slowly, I began to press onward, while keeping a close eye on the tree line. I hadn't gone even 100 feet when I heard something that made my stomach sink like an anvil. The slight pitter-patter of footsteps in snow emanated slowly from the woods. 4 of them in total, with another snapping twig at the end. I stared, unblinking, in the direction of the noise, as the sound halted abruptly. Whatever it was seemed to be aware of the noise it had made, and stopped to not draw attention. My heart felt as though it was in my throat, as immediately the sensation of being hunted arose in my mind. I still couldn't see anything in the darkened woods, but I now knew I was being followed by someone or something. One of the things they teach in hunter's safety is the fact that the only things clumsy enough to snap twigs in the woods are bears and humans. Obviously, a bear would not be a welcome sight in any situation, and if it was a human that was stalking me, then the implications of that cannot be good. I picked up the pace and continued briskly walking, now just trying to get down as fast as possible and cursing the initial idea of leaving the bonfire in the first place. The thought then crossed my mind that maybe it was Chris trying to spook me. He honestly has never struck me as a prankster type, but I guess under the right circumstance he may go for it. Although he likely knew I was armed, and I doubted he would risk a tragic accident for a quick laugh. It just didn't make sense, and my mind raced as I tried to figure out what it was that followed me. Not long after, the footsteps began to re-emerge. That dreadful pitter-patter of crunching snow filled me with anxiety. I decided to just keep walking and see what my pursuer would do. The footsteps continued and began to slowly increase in frequency, as did my heart rate. I began rapidly glancing back over my shoulder, desperately trying to get a glimpse of my stalker. And the footsteps seemed to grow closer and closer, but still I saw nothing. And deciding I couldn't take any more, I stopped and drew my revolver. I called out for Chris again, warning him that I was armed and not to mess with me. As I expected, though, there was no response. The footsteps had again stopped, leaving me alone in the silence once more. My nerves got the better of me in that moment. I raised my revolver and fired a warning shot into the bank by the tree line, away from the direction of the footsteps. The serene night was pierced by the deafening concussion of the bullet. My ears were accosted by the blast, making it difficult to ascertain any response from my pursuer. I waited for a couple seconds and heard nothing in response, except for the ringing in my ears. After hearing nothing for quite a while, I decided to continue my descent. Not a minute later, the footsteps returned, but this time at a much more rapid pace. The steps drew even nearer, now seemingly only a couple meters away. I began to run now, on the brink of absolute terror. Whatever was on my trail was now quite obviously hostile. I heard the crunching and the violent snapping of twigs coming from behind me. I turned back to see trees and branches snapping wildly as a large, dark figure moved rapidly through the woods. Whatever it was bipedal and massive. The thing had to be at least 10 feet tall. I thought it to be a bear, but knew that there was no way a bear could possibly move that quickly on only 2 legs. As I glanced back, my foot fell upon a patch of ice, causing me to slide and eventually come crashing down to the frozen ground below. Immediately, I whipped my head back up, aiming a quivering hand with revolver towards the woods. My heart thundered wildly in my chest, but the beast, whatever it was, had stopped. No more movement came from the woods. Quickly, I regained my footing, staring intently at the woods. My pursuer had ceased all movement, and again the environment had fallen silent, save for my labored breaths. I stood and stared towards the woods, desperately trying to identify what or who it was that was after me. By this point, of course, the notion of a human follower was simply out of the question. It seemed like I stood there motionless for hours, but in reality, the adrenaline surge was probably just obfuscating my perception of time. I aimed a shaking arm and revolver towards the woods, debating whether or not to fire another warning shot. Suddenly, a noise chilled me to my very core. A low, guttural howl blared like a crash of thunder from within the woods. The noise was so loud, it seemed to shake the very trees around me. It sounded almost like a howler monkey, but at a much lower octave, and much more threatening. The roar made me tremble, and in my heightened frenzy, I forgot any notion of standing my ground, and took off in a mad sprint down the mountainous road. I was forced to stop after several minutes of desperate, unabated running, unable to continue as my lungs threatened to implode. Damn cigarettes. And the entire time, I hadn't so much as glanced behind me. I scanned in all directions, panting heavily from the late-night workout. Again, I saw and heard nothing. For several minutes I waited, listening intently while trying to replenish my exhausted lungs. I had almost fooled myself into believing I had gotten away, until a commotion drew my attention yet again. The crashing and snapping of twigs again began from somewhere back in the woods. I could not see, but definitely could hear the beast in a mad dash towards my position. I raised my revolver again, knowing that my only chance now was to stand my ground and fight. My knees shook wildly below me, threatening to give out at any moment. The wreckage grew closer and closer, until its wake of destruction was in view. The Leviathan beast tore through the grove like tissue paper, flinging branches, snow, and everything else out of its way like nothing. It reached the edge of the woods and suddenly stopped about 20 yards away. It was then that I got my first and only true look at the creature. My previous estimate of 10 feet was probably a little overzealous, but it did stand at least 7.5, if not 8 feet tall. Thick, knotted black hair covered its entire muscular frame from head to toe. Its eyes were deep pools of black, or a dark brown, which seemed to drink in all light from the moon above. Its face and jawline were large, but hard to discern in the shadows. The beast stood motionless and almost silent, with the only noise being that of its slow, methodical, deep breaths. I have never felt terror so strong as I did in that moment. Animals are good at sensing fear, and despite my horror, I did my best to remain steadfast and unwavering. The beast and I shared a deadlocked gaze with one another, both of us seeming to size the other one up. I clutched my .44 tightly, set dead to rights, directly at the creature, and ready to unleash hell at a moment's notice. Every fiber of my being was screaming out for me to shoot the thing, and if it would have charged me, I would have. But it didn't. Instead, it let out another guttural howl, but this time it was significantly lower in volume and tone. I find this part hard to convey, but to me, the screech did not seem like one of a threat, but instead, a plea. If the creature truly did intend to hunt me, then why would it reveal itself to me like that? Why stop and simply stare from the side of the road, when it could have easily charged me down during my panic-stricken dash and tore me limb from limb? I felt my arm slowly lower the revolver to my side, almost subconsciously. The beast let out a grunt and cocked its head from the shadows. We stared at each other again, a strange feeling of understanding between us. Suddenly, the beast broke the stare and took a step forward. The move caught me off guard, and as if on instinct, I again raised the revolver in its direction. The creature then did something I never would have expected. It froze. As soon as my revolver fell upon it, it ceased all movement. It's as if the beast knew what a firearm was and the danger it represented. Could an animal possibly understand the significance of such an item? I don't know the answer, but in any case, I chose not to fire. The beast seemed a lot less hostile than it initially did, and I got the sense that it was not after me to hurt me, but instead to ward me off. Suddenly, the creature lifted its head and made that low, guttural noise again, this time seeming as if it was surprised by something. I stared in abstract confusion as it lifted its massive right arm and extended its index finger in a curled but definitive pointing motion. Out of my peripherals, I saw light beginning to increase behind me, but dared not look for fear of the thing. The increasing light allowed me to view the creature's face in detail for the first time. It had dark brown, almost black eyes, large ridges on its forehead, and the distinctive facial shape of a primate. The beast then slowly lowered its arm and grunted again, before suddenly turning and charging back into the woods from which it came. The tree branches splintered and exploded as the beast rushed back into the thick blanket of the forest. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, and the eerie silence returned. I found myself at a loss after that. I could still sense eyes watching me, concealed in the darkness of the forest, but somehow I knew the beast would not return. I turned in the direction it had pointed, and saw headlights in the distance racing towards me. I holstered my pistol, and the car drove up beside me moments later. It was Chris and Alex. With a hand winch, we needed to hopefully escape. They greeted me as if nothing was wrong, but soon seemed to sense the shocked look on my face. I was clearly shaken from my encounter, and they could see it. They pried me for answers, but I didn't say much. I couldn't tell them. I would have seemed insane. So I remained silent. I was severely hesitant to go back up the mountain, but I knew we had no choice. Alex drove his car as far as it would take us, but once we hit dirt, we knew it would take us no further. We grabbed the winch and reluctantly headed back up on foot. It took us a good hour to reach the area again, and the entire way I felt severely paranoid. I sensed we were being watched the entire time. A few times I thought I heard the footsteps again, and saw the shadows in the trees, though the beast never appeared again. Much to my relief, we eventually reached the bonfire again. It was probably 3 a.m. by that point, and the fire had long since extinguished, and only smoldering coals remained. Eric and the girls were all passed out in his truck. We woke him up, and with some struggle, were finally able to free his truck and get out of there. Now, I know what most of you are probably thinking. It was Bigfoot. And I'll admit, it sure does seem that way. I've never really believed in such superstition, and just never understood how a primate that large could go unobserved and unconfirmed for so long. Needless to say, I'm a believer now. I think those things are a lot smarter than we ever give them credit for. From its apparent recognition of my gun, to the way it gestured at the approaching distant headlights of Alex. Maybe it's not so outrageous to think that it possesses some advanced cognitive abilities, maybe even close to that of humans. It would surely require ample intelligence to be able to elude capture or even video recording for so long. An animal of that size has to have no natural predators, at least not in these woods, and thus the only true threat it would face would be that posed by the most dangerous animals of all, us. I've always wondered to myself, and perhaps you've wondered as well. Thousands, if not millions of people claim to have seen these creatures or interacted with it to some capacity. Why has no one ever shot one? The mere notion of bringing down such a beast for promise of fame and notoriety has to get every hunter's blood pumping, not to mention the inherent lucrative incentive which comes stapled to it. Well, I can tell you now, as someone who came face to face with this supposed Bigfoot and had such an opportunity, I never would have felt right taking it. When I looked at that creature, I saw not a demon or a monster. I saw an animal, a primate, just trying to survive. It could have hunted me down and tore me limb from limb with ease. Hell, it could have killed all of us that night. It had every imaginable advantage on me, save for the gun, and it didn't take it. It chose to instead confront me and scare me off. I don't know if it had anything to do with that deer in the tree, but maybe that was a macabre warning it had constructed. Perhaps it had a family nearby that it was defending, as primates do normally live in small groups. Who knows? Perhaps it knew that killing me would have meant others would come looking for me. I don't pretend to know exactly why it did what it did, but one thing's for sure. Had I pulled that trigger, I never would have felt right about it. Sure, I could have and probably would have received fame and notoriety from the media, but that's just not me. I have no doubt that there are other hunters out there who would not think twice about shooting it, but I don't want that on my conscience. As soon as that cat was out of the bag, others would hunt the rest of them down relentlessly, driven by the promise of greed and fame. It's how humanity has always been. Someone finds something of value, and the cockroaches swarm to ravage and cannibalize it until nothing remains. Killing that one creature would have doomed the entire species. I've never gone back to Wildcat after that night. It just doesn't feel right anymore. Plus, it's blocked off and near impossible to access except by foot. More importantly, though, I came to recognize that that mountain is its territory, and it does not want intruders, and I don't want to try its patience. For those of you who would doubt my account, well, then Wildcat Mountain waits for you. Feel free to prove me wrong, and take a midnight stroll up there anytime you desire and report back. I would not encourage anyone to go there, but if you are truly adamant, then I can't stop you. I myself don't plan on ever going back. Lately, there's been one thing that's been on my mind, though. Maybe the massive parties and tragic death of that girl weren't the only reason that Wildcat Mountain was blocked off by the cops. And maybe it wasn't even blocked off by the cops at all. Devil's Creek. I'm from Kentucky, and you might hear some southern word choices. This experience really freaked me and my friends out. This story is 100% true. This story takes place in Kentucky in the fall of 2010. I was 17 and a senior in high school at the time. Me and my friends would hang out most weekends, and one Friday we decided to go to Devil's Creek. Devil's Creek is located in Corbin, Kentucky. It is a long gravel road that leads deep into the forest and up through the mountains. I'm pretty sure the forest is part of the Daniel Boone National Forest, but I am not 100% sure. The road goes on for miles, and it is surrounded by nothing but forest and mountains. It is known for a good place to go horseback riding, and I think people camp out there. But I don't know who would be so bold enough to do so. So Devil's Creek connects to another place called Dog Slaughter. Some of the area is considered Dog Slaughter, and some is considered Devil's Creek. Let me add that these are the actual names of these places, not just nicknames made up by people. The name Dog Slaughter came years ago. Apparently it got its name because people had a hard time keeping dogs as pets, because they would fall off the large cliffs and die. And the origins of the name is pretty dark, I know. But as far as I know, that is the accurate origin of the name. Some people say it was because farmers there bred dogs to get a good farming dog, and if the puppies showed signs of not being a good fit for the job, the farmers would put them in a sack and throw them off the cliffs. The first story is the one that most people think is true. But anyways, Devil's Creek is a well-known place around here, and it has all kinds of different rumors and stories associated with it. Some include ghosts, devil worshippers, and a giant Birdman creature. Some claim to have seen the Birdman, and some say a couple was killed by him after he ripped their car roof off. Of course, that is crazy, and I'm confident that the Birdman doesn't really exist. However, when it comes to the ghosts and the devil worshippers, there is more truth to these stories. There is a graveyard far back in Devil's Creek, and many ghost hunters have been there and captured pictures of orbs and other strange paranormal phenomena. You can actually Google it and find pictures and their findings. Now, about the devil worshippers. Years ago there was a devil worshipping church, and it was located below the graveyard, and some people apparently burned it down during one of their meetings, and to this day, the concrete slab in which the church was built on still remains. They say on some nights you can smell fire and hear the spirits of the devil worshippers chanting. I don't know about the fire smell or the chanting, but I know the church was real. And before we continue, Here was a mini story to go along with the story. I'd been to Devil's Creek once before, about 2 years before the story takes place. My brother, my cousin, and I decided to go to Devil's Creek one night after bowling. We weren't sure how to get there, so we used my brother's cheap GPS to find it. The GPS sent us on the opposite side of Devil's Creek near a lake. It was so dark, we actually almost wrecked into the lake. We were literally only inches away from the water before we realized that it was water. We turned around and went down a small road leading into the forest. The road we came on was extremely dark and creepy. It was only big enough for one car. I remember the headlights of my brother's car shining down the long dark road. It was a seemingly endless straight gravel road surrounded by trees. We drove down this road for about a minute and a half, and suddenly we all started to smell something burning. Luckily, my brother looked at his car's temperature gauge and noticed the hand was almost all the way up. His car was running very hot. He knew the right thing to do would be to turn off his car quickly before it got damaged or before it blew up, but there was no way we wanted to chance turning it off and not starting back. We were in the middle of nowhere, and we were flipping our shit. We had no service on our phones, and we could have been completely screwed if our car broke down. Luckily, we spotted a small clearing up ahead, on the side of the road, and we were able to turn around. We headed back the way we came, and his car's temperature instantaneously returned to normal, and his car never ran hot again for as long as he owned it. I don't know what happened there. I sincerely believe something very bad was waiting for us up ahead, and God, a guardian angel, or something forced us to turn around so we wouldn't die. Sure, it could have been a strange coincidence, but I don't think it was. It was so strange, and I never want to know what may have happened to us if we had continued down that road. Anyway, back to the main story. Now that you know a bit about this place, let us continue. Me and my friends headed up to Devil's Creek around 9, and we got there close to 10. We went the correct way this time, not the way I'd previously went. There was about 12 of us all together. We took 4 different cars. I haven't talked to these guys in a long time, but back then, all of these guys, but just a couple, were really close friends of mine. 3 of my friends were in my car. Chris and Josh rode in Andy's car, and if I can remember correctly, the other cars were drove by Ernie and Zach, and each one of their cars had 2 or 3 people in them. We all met up at the entrance and formed a line of 4 cars. I was the only one to have went to Devil's Creek before, and I got the pleasure of being first in line. At the beginning of the road, things were pretty normal. There was a few nice houses around, but as you leave the blacktop hit gravel, there's an old barn with Devil's Creek painted on it. It is very creepy to say the least. I've attached a picture of the barn to this story. You can also just Google search Devil's Creek, Corbin, Kentucky, and find pictures of the barn along with some pictures of the ghost sightings. I have attached a few of those as well. If I'm not mistaken, I believe another friend of mine went to Devil's Creek recently and told me the barn had been torn down. I'm not sure. I haven't been back since this happened, so I can't confirm that. I started along the dark gravel road, surrounded by nothing but forest, and the other 3 cars followed closely behind. No one had service on their phones, not one bar. The service cut out way before we even made it to the beginning of Devil's Creek. After about 20 minutes of driving, we made it to the graveyard. All of us got out and went exploring. We felt pretty safe, being in such a large group of people. After a few minutes of exploring, we heard really loud noises coming from the mountains. It sounded like a bunch of Indians doing a war cry or something. The noise was far, far off though, so we weren't too worried about it. We assumed it was people doing the same thing we were doing or something. We didn't come across anything worth mentioning at the graveyard. We were, however, amused by how old some of the graves were. They dated way back to the 1800s. Some so old we couldn't even make out a date. And some were just rocks with evidence of carved writing, but no chance at making out what it said. We left the graveyard and continued on. We continued down the road for about 15 minutes, and I think we were in dog slaughter at that point. We saw a narrow trail leading to the right. The guys with me in my car were anxious to explore it. The trail was only wide enough for us to go straight, and I tried to tell them that if we all go down this trail and hit a dead end, we would all have to back up out of it. That didn't bother them, and they kept on insisting that we go. So we all started down the trail. After about 5 minutes of going down this trail, I knew everyone were starting to get freaked out at that point. We were in the middle of nowhere, far back on a little trail that just led deeper and deeper into thick forest. We then saw a small blue light up ahead. It immediately caught the attention of everyone in my car. I don't think any of the cars behind me seen it. It appeared to be really far away, at least a football field and a half away, but after just a few feet, the darkness revealed a large man standing there in the middle of the trail, holding what appeared to be a little laser pointer type thing. All of our hearts dropped and everyone started to panic. That guy was just a few feet away, standing in front of my car. We were trying our damnedest to get the guys to start backing out of there by motioning with our hands and whatnot. Again, we couldn't go left or right, we could only go backwards. The man walked up to the driver window before anyone could move. My window was already rolled down. He stuck his large head inside my car, and he reeked of alcohol. He then looked at us and said in a loud, raspy voice, "What the hell are you all doing here?" Right at that very moment, another guy came riding out of the dark woods on this huge white horse. I've never seen a horse that big, and I didn't think horses could get that big. I would say it at least stood 7.5 feet tall, and I'm not shitting you. The person riding it was a man that looked like he came straight from the cast of The Hills Have Eyes. He literally looked just like one of them. He was bald, but with a few strands of thin hair remaining. His extremely disturbing smile he wore the entire time revealed that he didn't have a single tooth in his head, and he had a pistol attached to his hip. He parked his horse beside the last car in the line, so we wouldn't be able to back out. Everyone remained in their cars. We all were raised on guns, but not one person brought one along for some reason. As the horseman sat there blocking the entire trail, the first man continued to talk to me and asked me several questions such as, "Who are you? Where do y'all live? Does anyone know y'all are out here?" And other sketchy questions. And as I talked to him, another figure started coming from the dark forest. It was a kid. He stumbled up to my car, holding a big bottle of Jim Beam. This kid looked to be no older than 12 years old. The kid asked me with a non-mature voice if I had any beer. I said no, and he said, "Well, I'm not giving you any of mine, but you know what? You don't know what we had to go through to get this. But I might let you smell my liquor if you're lucky," he added. This little kid was drunk off his ass. Every one of them were drunk off their asses. The horse even acted drunk. The man then told me to wait here. He and the drunken little kid went to Andy's car, which was directly behind me. I couldn't hear the conversation they were having, mostly because of everyone in my car freaking out, expressing their thoughts on what is going to happen to us, and discussing ways to get out of this mess. What we did hear was the man scream, "You're in Devil's Creek now, boy!" It made us jump. He then went to the other cars and did the same thing. Now, by the time he was at the last car, it had been only about 4 or 5 minutes since we first met the man. He started walking over towards the forest, and he yelled for the horseman to come over to him. The three of them were discussing something quietly. The car in the far back quickly threw his car in reverse and backed up toward the left and hit a tree, but he still managed to back up far enough to get turned around. The third car in line threw it in reverse immediately after, and within just a couple seconds, they were out of sight. It took those guys longer than it should have for the drunk maniacs to realize what happened. Andy was able to get turned around too during this time when the horseman started trying to block him, but he was able to get turned around. I was in the process of turning around, but I wasn't having much luck. The horseman was running towards the cars that left. I don't know where the kid went, but the first man got to my car right as I got turned around, and the crazy bastard jumped on my hood and wouldn't let go. He was drunk as shit. Just try to imagine a big, drunk lunatic trying to hold on to a car hood without falling while getting bumped around. He scratched my hood up pretty bad with his boots. He pulled a large hunting knife out of his holster on the side and was yelling that he was gonna go lay us on the slab. By the slab, he was meaning the slab of concrete where the church was built. Luckily, one good mud hole created enough force to make him slide off of the right side of my hood and roll down a hill. We hauled ass out of there, expecting to see the horseman, but we never saw him. I was doing 65-70 miles an hour down the road in the direction of civilization. I almost wrecked several times. It took quite a while, but we finally hit blacktop again. We continued on until we came to a Waffle House, where we saw all our friends parked on their cell phones, staring in our direction. When we pulled up, they were relieved. They did not call the police, but they said they were going to if we didn't show up within the next few minutes. Everyone was equally freaked the hell out. We all started discussing what happened. Andy said when the man came to his window, he told him that he had just sliced his bitch's throat and threw her in a ditch. And Andy said he was asking the horseman which car he was wanting. The horseman said he wanted Andy's car, and the man told him bullshit, this one is mine. He told the guys in the other cars some crazy shit, like that they had been living in these mountains for years and haven't been caught yet. They didn't know what he meant by caught, but they assumed caught for murdering people. We all came to a couple conclusions about what happened when these guys went over to discuss things, probably how they would pull off killing so many people, and what they would do with the cars, and what if someone knew we were there, that sort of thing. They went pretty far away from us to chat about it. We couldn't hear a word they said during that time. When the cars got turned around, the horseman went to try to stop them, but couldn't catch up with the first car, and since he could not catch the first car, he knew there would be witnesses alive to tell the tale of what happened to the police, so he fled into the forest. The man that jumped on my hood was trying to get us. He wanted to hurt us. I know that for a fact. Luckily, he was too drunk to accomplish it. Our other conclusions were perhaps these people were just random guys out camping and riding horses and got a little too drunk and wanted to have some fun at our expense. They just seemed far too creepy to fit that conclusion, and these guys were so far back in the middle of nowhere, I don't see why someone sane would go that far out to camp. And normal people don't let kids drink hard liquor. And normal people don't jump on your hood and try to get into your car and threaten to kill you with a knife and put you on a concrete slab where a devil worshipper's church once stood. I think the first conclusion was correct myself. I am very glad we had so many people with us, so many witnesses. If it were only one car, I'm certain we would have been murdered. I have never went back to Devil's Creek again, neither will any of the other guys. The Man in the Woods. When I woke up that morning, I never thought my day would turn out like it did. I was only 7 years old when this happened. I was living with my mom, sister, and little brother at the time. It started out as a normal Saturday. We hung out with friends and watched TV. Me and my friend were outside in the field that was by my house. There was also some woods at the edge of the field. It was the middle of November when this happened, but it was like 75 degrees out. We've gone in the woods before, so we weren't really scared of them. We had a dare for each other. He dared me to go into the woods by myself for 10 minutes, and so I did. 10 minutes later, I came back out, and he decided to go in for 10 minutes also. I waited for him a little. I went inside first to look at the clock to see what time it was so that I would know how long it would be before he came out. When I went in, I went to the two main spots we always went to, and I saw some guy walking around out there. When I was going back to the field, turned onto the path and came face to face with the man. He looked to be in his 40s or 50s. He gave me a toothless grin that gave me chills, and he said, "Hey there, kid." I told him I wasn't supposed to talk to strangers, and went back. Anyway, it had been 10 minutes since my friend went into the woods. It was 11-something a.m. About 45 minutes later, he still hadn't come out, so I went in to find him. I ended up getting lost, and I was starting to get scared. Every noise I heard made me jump, and I was starting to get hungry and thirsty. The temperature started to go down, and I was still in shorts and a t-shirt. I started getting really cold, and before I knew it, it snowed. It was weird for it to go from a nice, warm, sunny day to cold, gray, and snowy. I was crying at this point, calling out for my dad, even though he lived about 45 minutes away. It stopped snowing and began to rain for a little bit, and then that also stopped. It was so ugly looking outside. Eventually I found my friend, but it was the scariest thing ever. The man I encountered earlier was holding him in the air. My friend had a black eye. He was bleeding, and he was trying to scream, but he couldn't. The man looked over and saw me, and he threw my friend into a big rock and started sprinting at me. I tried to run, but I didn't make it too far before the man pushed me, and I went flying head first into the ground. The dirt was hard, and it made my nose bleed, and I felt a prick on my right pinky finger. I stood up, and the man grabbed me by the neck and slammed me to the ground and held me there. He pulled out a knife and cut me with it. He cut my upper lip, and I have a scar from it. I screamed at the top of my lungs. My friend hit the man with the stick, knocking him out cold. It was dark now. It was also freezing out. We were cold, scared, hungry, thirsty, alone. I felt guilty for not telling my friend about the man. We started sprinting as fast as our little legs would carry us in a random direction. We finally made it back home, and by then the sun was starting to come up. I told my mom what happened. She didn't do anything about it, so my right pinky finger got infected so bad that it swelled up and turned green, and I actually thought I was turning into the Hulk. My right pinky finger is now a lot bigger than the one on my left. I did end up having another encounter with a man a few months later. I'm not gonna lie, but even though no one got hurt, it was so much scarier. Maybe I will tell it in the future. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sorry it took me a lot longer to do this than I thought it would. I was hoping to get the video out on Tuesday, and I failed at that. But it's a long video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank everyone that took part and submitted stories. Also, I'm trying to help out two people right now. I have a friend who has set up a GoFundMe to try and get his single mom and her child a place to live. If you could maybe share the link on social media, that would be awesome. Then it would get some circulation. Also, a friend of mine named Dave, who has been with my channel for quite a while, was supposed to go with us 2 years ago when I made my Waverly Hills video. He was unfortunately prevented from going. Dave found out very recently that he is terminally ill and only has a year left to live. One of the things that he wants to do is go to Waverly Hills with me and my good friend Rebecca, and we'll make a follow-up video to the first one. I have set up a GoFundMe for that too. Now again, I am not asking anyone to donate. As you should know, I'm not someone who feels comfortable doing that, and nobody should feel any obligation to. But if you could share the links on social media so they can get some circulation, I'd appreciate that. So I'm not asking anybody for any donations, I'm just asking for a little bit of time to possibly forward the links on social media and hopefully they'll get around. If you want to read print versions of these stories, check them out at the Killer Orange Cat subreddit. Links to that and the merchandise store are in the description. In the meantime, if you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please consider hitting the subscribe button below, or using the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Feel free to leave me a comment to let me know what you think of the video, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. You can always follow Ichigo and myself on Facebook and Twitter using the links in the description. If you have a story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address provided in the description. My main requirement is that the story is original, meaning it has not yet been read on any other YouTube channel. And please, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.